Counselor Pei sat in his small office and stared at the report on his screen. He had written the same words 6 times now, in 6 different ways, and none of them made the problem sound any less embarrassing. The problem was simple. The observation deck, the most beautiful room on the entire research vessel Pale Horizon, had become a place that most of the crew was too afraid to visit. It was not broken. It was not locked. There was no official rule keeping anyone away. The problem was the predator clutch. 5 warriors from the 3 deadliest species in the Galactic Union had been assigned to the Pale Horizon as its security detail. They were Kathrani, Vitheron, and Phyrasi, armored reptiles who could crush metal with their hands, insectoids with venom in their jaws, winged hunters who could scream loud enough to stop a heart. They were there to keep the crew safe, and every evening, when their shift ended, they gathered on the observation deck to sit in silence beneath the nebula light. No one told the rest of the crew to stay away. No one needed to. The herbivore species on board could smell the predators from 2 corridors away. The Halisi, the small diplomatic species that Pei belonged to, had a survival instinct that went back 40,000 years. That instinct said one thing very clearly. Do not walk into a dark room full of apex predators. So the most beautiful room on the ship belonged to 5 warriors who sat in it alone every single night. Pei closed the report and rubbed his face with his small 3-fingered hands. He had tried everything. Movie nights, guided meditation sessions, a poetry reading. The poetry reading had ended when Gorvash, the leader of the clutch, had walked in, and every single attendee had left within 90 seconds. Gorvash had not done anything. He had simply existed in the doorway. 8 feet tall, 400 pounds of gray-scaled muscle and old battle scars. Eyes like 2 drops of liquid iron. Pei sighed and made a note in his file. Social integration status. Failed. Again. 3 levels below, in a small family cabin near the engineering wing, a woman named Yuna was trying to unpack a box, while her husband Du-Yun held a kitten above his head and made airplane sounds with his mouth. Du-Yun, Yuna said without looking up, please put the cat down. She likes it, Du-Yun said. The kitten, a small orange tabby named Nabby, did not look like she liked it. She looked like she was thinking about her life choices. Du-Yun lowered her gently, and she immediately jumped off his hands and ran under the bed. She is going to scratch your face one day, Yuna said. She loves me too much, Du-Yun said. They were among the first humans to serve on a Galactic Union research vessel. Yuna was a xenobiologist. Du-Yun was a structural engineer. They had brought their 7-year-old son Taeho, and under Yuna's research credentials, a 4-month-old kitten registered as a psychological comfort organism. Most of the alien crew had never seen a human before. None of them had ever seen a cat. The Halisi thought Nabi was a predator. This was technically true. She was a predator of small bugs, loose threads, and the occasional sock. Taeho had spent his first 3 days on the ship the way he spent most of his time anywhere, quietly exploring. He was a small boy, thin and serious, with round glasses, and a habit of tilting his head when he looked at something interesting. He found almost everything interesting. He had already memorized the names of 11 alien species on board. He could say hello in Kathrani, which sounded like a deep rumble from the bottom of a well. He had tried to say hello to a group of Halisi crew members in the hallway, and they had smiled at him with visible terror. He did not understand why everyone seemed so nervous around him. He was 7. He weighed 23 kilograms. He was missing one of his front teeth. On the 4th evening, Do-Yun was called to an emergency repair on the lower hull, a microfracture in one of the support beams. Nothing dangerous, but it needed his hands and his tools and probably several hours of his time. Yuna was already deep in her lab, running molecular scans on a sample collection that could not be paused. Taeho was alone in the cabin with Nabi. He was not scared. He was bored. He had already read his book. He had already drawn 3 pictures. Nabi was sitting on the windowsill, staring at the corridor lights outside with the intense focus that cats reserve for things that do not matter at all. She was warm and soft, and she purred immediately, the way she always did when he held her. He put her against his chest and walked out of the cabin. He had heard about the observation deck from a Halisi engineer who had described it as the most beautiful place on the ship. A great dome of transparent material at the very top, where you could look out and see the stars, and the nebula, and the endless dark all around you. Tejo wanted to see the stars. He walked through the corridors, following the signs. The ship was quieter at this hour. The lights were dimmed to simulate evening. He passed a few crew members who glanced at him and the small orange creature in his arms with curiosity, but no one stopped him. He was a child. Children wander. He reached the observation deck entrance. The door was open. The room beyond was dark except for the light of the nebula itself, which poured through the great dome like slow purple fire. It was the most beautiful thing Tejo had ever seen. He walked inside. He did not notice the shapes in the dark. He did not see the massive armored figure seated near the left wall, or the insectoid form folded into a meditative posture near the center, or the winged shadow perched on the upper railing, or the second Kathrani crouched near the entrance like a guard carved from stone. He walked straight past all of them. His small shoes made soft sounds on the floor. Nabi's purring was a tiny, steady engine against his chest. He reached the viewport at the far end of the room, where the nebula filled the entire view like a painting made of light and dust and color. He sat down on the cold floor. He put Nabi on his lap. He pressed his forehead against the glass. "Look, Nabi," he whispered. "Stars." Nabi looked. She blinked slowly, the way cats do when they are perfectly content. Then she curled into a small orange circle on his thigh and closed her eyes. Behind them, in the dark, nothing moved. Gorvash, commander of the Predator Clutch, veteran of 11 planetary campaigns, a warrior who had once torn the door off a gunship with his bare hands, sat perfectly still in his chair. His iron eyes were fixed on the small human boy and the tiny orange creature sitting at his lap. He did not speak. He did not move. He barely breathed. Beside him, Renkai, the youngest Kathrani, had one hand on the blade at his belt, not because he intended to use it, but because he did not know what else to do with his hands. Across the room, Silith, the Vytheran philosopher hunter, had stopped clicking her mandibles for the first time in hours. Above them all, Droma, the winged Phairossi, had dimmed his bioluminescence until he was nearly invisible against the ceiling. The Phairossi equivalent of holding your breath. A child had walked into a room full of the most dangerous creatures on the ship. He had sat down among them as if they were furniture. And the tiny creature in his arms was making a sound that none of them had ever heard before. A low, soft, continuous vibration, warm, steady, completely without fear. Gorvash stared at the boy. The boy stared at the stars. And the nebula burned on in silence, painting them all in shades of purple and gold. For 12 full minutes, nobody in the observation deck moved. Gorvash counted. It was a habit from his years in combat. When you did not understand a situation, you measured it, you watched, you counted the seconds until something made sense. Nothing made sense. The human child sat at the viewport with his back to the room. The small orange creature was curled on his lap, and it was still making that sound, that low, soft, steady vibration that Gorvash could feel in the floor through the soles of his feet. He had heard many sounds in his long life: war drums, death screams, the cracking of bones, and the hiss of plasma fire. He had never heard anything like this. It was not a threat. It was not a warning. It was not communication in any way his instincts could classify. It was simply warm. Renkai was the first to crack. The young Kathrani scout had been holding his blade handle so tightly that his claws had left marks in the grip. He released it slowly, flexed his fingers, and leaned forward. His yellow eyes were locked on the small orange creature. "Commander," Renkai whispered. His voice was like gravel being poured into a bucket. "What is it?" Gorvash did not answer. He did not know. From the upper railing, Droma shifted. The Phyraci's wings were folded tight against his back, and his bioluminescent scales had gone completely dark. He was watching the child the way a hawk watches something it cannot decide is food, or a threat, or neither. His long neck was extended, his head tilted, and his slit-pupiled eyes were wide. "It is making a frequency," Droma said quietly. His voice was high and musical, like a flute made of glass. "The small creature. The frequency is between 25 and 50 hertz. It is, I do not have a word for it. It is the opposite of a hunting cry." "The opposite of a hunting cry," Silith repeated from her position on the floor. The Vytherin insectoid unfolded 2 of her 6 limbs and tilted her head. Her compound eyes reflected the nebula light in 1,000 tiny fragments. "What is the opposite of a hunting cry?" Nobody answered that either. Teho had not noticed any of this. He was busy watching a cluster of young stars being born inside the nebula. They looked like tiny bright dots appearing one by one, like someone was poking holes in dark paper and letting light through. He pressed his hand against the glass and spread his fingers. The stars sat between them, like jewels. Nabi stirred on his lap, yawned and stretched her front paws. Her claws came out for a moment, tiny and white and sharp, and then retracted. She kneaded his leg twice, circled and settled again. The purring did not stop. If anything, it got louder. Gorvash made his decision. He stood up. The movement was enormous. When a Kathrani stands, it is not a casual thing. 400 pounds of scaled muscle and bone rose from the chair like a mountain deciding to go for a walk. The floor vibrated slightly. Renkai stiffened. Silith's mandibles parted. Droma's scales flickered once with pale light. Gorvash walked toward the child. Each step was slow and deliberate. He was aware that his footsteps alone could frighten most species on the ship. He was aware that his shadow, cast by the nebula light, stretched across the floor like something from a nightmare. He stopped 3 meters from the boy. He lowered himself to one knee. Even kneeling, he was taller than the child would be standing. "Small one," Gorvash said. His voice was the lowest sound in the room. It was deeper than thunder, and softer than he had intended it to be. Teho turned around. He looked at the massive head, the iron-colored eyes, the jaw that could bite through steel cable, the scars that ran across the warrior's face like a map of violence. Teho smiled. It was a gap-toothed smile, open and honest and completely without fear. And it hit Gorvash like a punch to the chest, because in all his years of war and duty and blood, nothing had ever been aimed at him with such simple, stupid, impossible trust. "Hello," Teho said. "Are you watching the stars too?" Gorvash blinked. It took him a moment to find words. "Yes," he said. "They are really pretty," Teho said. He turned back to the viewport and pointed. "That one is being born right now. My mom told me that stars are born inside clouds like this. She said it takes a really long time, but if you watch carefully, you can see them get brighter." Gorvash looked at the nebula. He had sat beneath it many nights. He had never thought of the stars as being born. He had never watched them get brighter. "What is that creature?" he asked. Teho looked down at Nabi. "She is my cat. Her name is Nabi. It means butterfly." "Butterfly," Gorvash repeated. The word sounded strange in his deep voice, like a boulder trying to say something gentle. "She is very friendly," Tejo said. "Do you want to pet her?" Gorvash looked at his own hand. It was the size of the child's entire torso. His claws were black and thick and curved. He had killed with that hand more times than he could remember. "I do not think that would be wise," he said. "She will not bite," Tejo said. "She only bites my dad, and that is because he holds her wrong." Behind them, Renkai made a sound that might have been a laugh, if Kathrani laughed. It came out as a short, sharp grunt. He covered it by pretending to cough. Curiosity won. It always did with Renkai. He was the youngest of the clutch, barely past his warrior trials, and he had not yet learned to crush every impulse that was not strictly military. He moved forward, crouching low, his body close to the ground. He moved the way Kathrani moved when they were stalking, but slower, gentler, with his claws retracted and his head low. He stopped 1 meter from the boy and the kitten. His yellow eyes were level with Nabi. Nabi opened her eyes. She looked at Renkai. Renkai looked at her. For a moment, predator and predator regarded each other across the vast and ancient distance between their species. Then, Nabi stood up, stretched, walked directly across Tejo's lap, and headbutted Renkai's enormous clawed hand. She pushed her small orange head against his knuckles and rubbed her cheek along his scales. She turned and did it again. And again, her purring doubled in volume. Renkai did not breathe. His hand was frozen in the air. His claws, each one longer than the kitten's entire body, were curled upward and away, as far from the small creature as he could hold them. His eyes were wide. There was something in them that looked very much like panic. He looked at Gorvash. Gorvash offered no help. He looked at the child. "What is it doing?" Renkai asked. His voice was barely a whisper. Tejo grinned. "That means she likes you. She is rubbing her scent on you. It means she thinks you are safe." "Safe," Renkai repeated. The word sounded foreign coming from him. He was a Kathrani stout. He had been designed by evolution and training to be the opposite of safe. Everything about him, from his razor claws to his armored hide to his predator eyes, existed to make other creatures feel unsafe. And this tiny orange creature, this impossibly small thing, with its ridiculous whiskers and its soft belly and its paws the size of coins, had looked at him and decided he was safe. Renkai swallowed hard. His throat clicked. Above them, Droma had descended silently from the railing. The Phairasi moved like smoke, his wings half spread, his long body curving through the air without a sound. He landed a few meters away and folded himself into a low crouch, his neck extended, his luminescent scales flickering with faint, uncertain colors. Curiosity in a Phairasi looked exactly like curiosity in a cat. Wide eyes, slow movements, complete and total attention. Silith rose from her meditation and walked closer on all 6 limbs. Her movements were precise and mechanical, each leg placing itself with mathematical accuracy. She stopped beside Gorvash and folded 4 of her limbs beneath her body. "The vibration," she said quietly. "It is affecting my neural calm receptors. This is unexpected. The creature produces a frequency that mimics the hive mother's settling tone. I have not felt this calm since I left my home colony." "I feel it too," Droma admitted. "It is like warmth, but from the inside." The 4 predators looked at each other. They were uncomfortable, not because of the child or the kitten, but because of what the child and the kitten were making them feel. They were warriors. They had been born to hunt and to fight and to guard. And now they were sitting on the floor of the observation deck, gathered around a 7-year-old boy and a 4-month-old cat, and they did not want to leave. 4 massive, deadly alien predators, each one capable of ending his life in less than a second, all staring at him and his kitten with expressions that ranged from confusion to something softer that none of them had names for. "Do you all want to watch the stars with me?" Taeho asked. The silence that followed lasted 5 seconds. Then Gorvash sat down. He lowered his enormous body to the floor, crossed his legs, and turned his iron eyes to the viewport. The nebula painted his scarred face in shades of violet. Renkai sat next, then Sylith, then Droma, who folded his wings and dimmed his scales to a soft, warm blue. Nabi purred. Taeho smiled and turned back to the stars, and for the first time in the long history of the Pale Horizon, the Predator Clutch had company. Not because someone had been brave enough to face them, but because someone had been too innocent to know he was supposed to be afraid. The rumor spread through the Pale Horizon, the way fire spreads through dry grass. Quietly at first, then everywhere at once. A human child had sat with the Predator Clutch, on the observation deck, in the dark, alone, and he was still alive. Not only alive, but apparently he had smiled at Gorvash, and the small predator creature he carried had touched Renkai with its head, on purpose. The Halisi crew members discussed this in horrified whispers in the cafeteria. The Drovani engineers, a species of gentle, four-armed herbivores who flinched at loud noises, refused to believe it until 3 separate witnesses confirmed the story. Even the ship's medical officer, a calm and unshakable Pelori named Tev, raised both of her eyebrows when she heard, which for a Pelori was the equivalent of screaming. Counselor Pei received 14 messages in one morning, all asking the same question. Was the human child safe? Should someone intervene? Was this some kind of predator behavior that the herbivore species did not understand? Pei did not know. He sent a careful message to Yuna, Taeho's mother, explaining what had happened, and asking if she was aware that her son had spent the previous evening sitting among the most dangerous beings on the ship. Yuna read the message. She looked at Doyun. Doyun looked at her. "Did you know about this?" she asked. "No," Doyun said. He paused. "But it sounds like something he would do." This was true. Taeho had always been like this. When he was 4, he had walked up to a stray dog twice his size in a park and sat down next to it. When he was 5, he had found a spider in his room and carried it outside in his bare hands while Yuna stood on a chair. He did not understand fear the way other children did. It was not that he was brave. Bravery required knowing something was dangerous and doing it anyway. Taeho simply looked at the world and saw things that needed kindness, and he gave it. Yuna went to the observation deck that evening. She stood in the corridor outside and watched through the door. Taeho was already there. He was sitting in the same spot by the viewport, with Nabi on his lap, and around him, at varying distances, sat the clutch. Gorvash was nearest to the entrance, his back to the door, positioned like a wall between the boy and anything that might come through. Renkai sat to the left, cross-legged on the floor, his blade set aside. Silith was reading on a datapad. Droma was perched on the railing above, his wings relaxed, his scales pulsing with slow, gentle colors. Nobody was talking. They were just sitting together, watching the nebula. Yuna stood there for a long time. Then she went back to her cabin and told Doyun that their son was fine. The next evening, Taeho went back, and the one after that, and the one after that. He carried Nabi every time. He sat in the same spot every time. And every time, the clutch was there, waiting, although none of them would ever have used that word. Gorvash told himself it was protocol. The human child was a crew dependent. He was in a restricted area during security hours. Someone had to monitor him. The fact that Gorvash could have simply told the boy to leave and did not, was a detail he chose not to examine. Renkai told himself it was curiosity. He was a scout. Scouts observed. He was observing the child and the small creature. The fact that he had started arriving at the observation deck 20 minutes earlier each evening to make sure he had a good spot was irrelevant. Syleth told herself it was academic interest. She was studying the interaction between a juvenile human and its companion animal. The purring frequency alone was worth a research paper. The fact that she had started reading aloud from her datapad because the child had once asked what she was reading, and the child had listened with wide, fascinated eyes, was simply a byproduct of the research. Droma told himself nothing. He had stopped pretending. It started with the lights. Droma's bioluminescent scales could produce hundreds of colors and patterns. Firasi used them for communication, for hunting, for mating displays, and for territorial warnings. They were a weapon, and a language, and an art form. On the fifth evening, Nabi noticed the lights. She was sitting on Teho's lap when Droma shifted on his perch, and a ripple of soft blue light ran across his wings. Nabi's head snapped up. Her ears went forward. Her eyes went round and black. She watched the light with the absolute unblinking intensity that cats reserve for things they intend to chase. And without thinking, without deciding, he sent a small pulse of light across the floor. A moving spot of pale gold, like a tiny sun sliding across the metal surface. Nabi launched off Teho's lap like a small orange missile. She chased the light. She skidded across the floor on her paws, sliding and tumbling and spinning. She pounced on it. It moved. She pounced again. It moved again. She crouched low, wiggled her small back end and leaped. The light danced away. Teho laughed. It was the first loud sound any of them had heard on the observation deck. It was high and clear and bright, and it bounced off the dome like a bell. Teho fell sideways onto the floor, holding his stomach, laughing so hard that no sound came out for a moment, and then more sound came out than seemed possible for a body that small. Droma froze. His scales flickered. For a Firasi, making a prey creature laugh was not a concept that existed. Making any creature react to his lights with anything other than fear or submission was not a concept that existed. The boy was laughing. The sound was doing something to Droma's chest that he could not explain and did not want to stop. He made the light again, a spiral this time, slow and golden, rolling across the floor in a wide circle. Nabi chased it. Teho laughed harder. Droma made it faster. Nabi ran faster. Her small paws barely touched the ground. She was a blur of orange fur and wild eyes, and pure, joyful, pointless energy. Teho was on his back now, feet kicking the air, tears running down his cheeks. Renkai watched all of this, with his jaw slightly open. Then he made that sound again, the short, sharp grunt. But this time, it came twice, and it sounded very much like laughter. Even Gorvash's mouth moved. Just slightly, but it moved. On the seventh evening, Syleth read aloud from a Vytheran philosophical text about the nature of consciousness. Teho sat beside her and listened. When she finished a passage, he asked, "But how do you know that the bugs in the story are really thinking? Maybe they are just pretending." Syleth stopped. She turned 3 of her compound eyes toward the boy. "That," she said slowly, "is the central question of Vytheran philosophy. Scholars have debated it for 900 years. "Did they figure it out?" Teho asked. "No." "Maybe they should ask the bugs," Teho said. Syleth stared at him for a long time. Then she began writing something on her datapad. She wrote for an hour. She did not tell anyone what she was writing, but the title of the document was On Simplicity and Sight, Observations from a Human Juvenile. On the 9th evening, Teho found a small object on his usual sitting spot. It was a carved figure, no bigger than his hand, made from a gray composite material. It was rough and simple, but it was clearly a Kathrani warrior, with tiny claws and a broad chest and 2 small dots for eyes. Teho picked it up and held it carefully. He looked around the room. Renkai was sitting in his usual place, staring very hard at the nebula. He did not look at the boy. He did not look at anything except the nebula. His jaw was tight. Taeho walked over to him and held up the figure. "Did you make this?" Renkai's throat clicked. "It is nothing. Scrap material. I was testing my blade edge. It means nothing." Taeho looked at the figure again. Then he looked at Renkai. Then he hugged the figure against his chest with both arms. "It is the best thing anyone ever gave me," he said. Renkai did not respond, but his claws, which had been clenched tight against his palms, slowly opened and stayed open. On the 12th evening, Yuna told Do-Yun she wanted him to see the observation deck for himself. Do-Yun went. He stood in the doorway and looked at the scene inside. His son, asleep against the viewport, with Nabi curled on his chest. And around him, arranged in a loose circle like points on a compass, 4 alien predators, each one large enough and deadly enough to be a nightmare made real, sitting in silence and watching over the sleeping boy as if he were the most important thing in the universe. Do-Yun stepped inside. Gorvash turned his massive head. The two of them looked at each other. Human and Kethrani, father and warrior. 2 predators, separated by biology and evolution and 10,000 light years, recognizing something in each other that needed no translation. Do-Yun nodded. Gorvash nodded back. Do-Yun turned and left. Later, Counselor Pei summoned the courage to approach Gorvash directly. The small Halisi stood before the Kathrani commander, shaking only slightly, and asked why the clutch had allowed the human child to remain on the observation deck. Gorvash looked down at him. His iron eyes were unreadable. "The cub sits in my territory," Gorvash said. "What enters my territory, I protect. That is the law." Pei opened his mouth, then he closed it. Then he went back to his office and deleted every report he had ever written about the social segregation problem. He had a feeling it was solving itself. The alarm came without warning. One moment, the pale horizon was gliding through the nebula at standard cruise speed, the hum of its engines steady and familiar. The next moment, the ship lurched sideways, as if something had grabbed it by the spine and pulled. The lights flickered. Gravity stuttered, went heavy, then went light, and then came back wrong. Crew members stumbled. Equipment slid across tables. Somewhere deep in the hull, metal groaned in a voice that metal should not have. Then the alarm, a deep, pulsing tone that the entire crew had heard in drills, but never in reality. Proximity breach, unknown vessel, all personnel to shelter zones. Do-Yun was on the lower engineering deck when it happened. He grabbed a support beam as the gravity shifted, and held on until the floor remembered which way was down. His communicator was already buzzing. 3 fracture warnings, 2 pressure drops. A coolant line had cracked in Section 9. He tried to call Yuna. The internal communication system was scrambled. He tried to call Taeho's cabin. Nothing. He started running. Yuna was in her lab, 4 levels up. The molecular scanner she had been using was on the floor in pieces. She had already grabbed her emergency kit and was heading for the corridor when the second alarm hit. This one was different, sharper, more urgent. Boarding alert, hull breach on deck 7, hostile entry detected. Yuna's blood went cold. She pulled up the ship's locator system on her wrist device. Do-Yun was on deck 12. Taeho was... She scrolled. She searched. She could not find him in his cabin. She could not find him in any of the shelter zones. His locator signal showed him on the observation deck. Yuna ran. Taeho had been walking toward the deck when the ship lurched. He had fallen, caught himself, picked up Nabi who had tumbled out of his arms, and kept going. The alarms were loud, and the lights were wrong, and the floor was shaking, but the observation deck was close, and the observation deck was where his friends were. He did not think about shelter zones. He did not think about protocol. He thought about Gorvash, and Renkai, and Sylith, and Droma, and he thought that if something bad was happening, he wanted to be where they were. He reached the deck. The door was open. He ran inside. The nebula was still burning through the dome, purple and gold and endless. The room was dark except for that light, and in the dark, already on their feet, already moving, were the 4 warriors of the Predator Clutch. Gorvash had heard the alarm before it sounded. Kathrani ears could detect the vibration of an approaching vessel through the hull itself, the way a spider feels movement in its web. He had been on his feet 3 seconds before the first lurch. By the time the boarding alert came, he had already positioned Renkai at the entrance, Sylith at the secondary access point, and Droma in the air above. When Teho ran through the door, Gorvash turned. For one moment, the warrior and the child looked at each other. Teho was breathing hard. His glasses were crooked. Nabi was pressed against his chest, her fur puffed up, her eyes wide. He was scared. For the first time since he had walked into this room, he was actually scared. "Gorvash," he said. His voice was small. Gorvash crossed the room in 4 steps. He picked the boy up with one hand, as gently as if he were lifting a soap bubble, and carried him to the far corner of the deck, behind the main viewport support beam. He set him down. "Stay here," Gorvash said. "Do not move. Do you understand?" His lip was trembling, but he nodded. Gorvash looked at him for one more second. Then he turned and walked back toward the entrance. His steps were different now. Every trace of softness was gone. His claws were out. His shoulders were squared. His eyes had changed. They were no longer iron. They were something older and darker, and much, much worse. The Morokai came 7 minutes later. There were 4 of them. Morokai slave raiders, tall, lean, covered in dark chitinous plating, with long arms that ended in hooked claws designed for grabbing and holding. They were fast, and they were brutal, and they made their living by attacking research vessels, overwhelming the weak, and taking prisoners to sell on black market stations in the outer systems. Their bioscanners had shown them one small life sign on the observation deck. One small, helpless, valuable life sign. A juvenile, easy prey. The lead raider opened the door. The room was dark. The nebula light was purple and dim. He raised his scanner. Something moved in the dark. Gorvash hit the first raider like a freight train. There was no warning, no battle cry, no announcement. One moment, the raider was standing in the doorway, and the next moment, he was embedded in the far wall, his chest plate cracked, his breathing apparatus crushed, his body making a shape that bodies should not make. He slid to the floor and did not get up. The second raider had enough time to raise his weapon. He did not have enough time to fire it. Renkai came from the left side of the doorway, low and fast, moving the way Kathrani scouts moved when they were not pretending to be civilized. His blade took the weapon out of the raider's hand. His second blade took the raider off his feet. The raider hit the ground with a wet crunch. Renkai stood over him, both blades crossed, his yellow eyes burning. The third raider turned to run. Sylith was behind him. She had come through the secondary access point without making a single sound. 6 limbs, each one moving with surgical precision. She caught the raider's arm with 2 limbs, his leg with 2 more, and his neck with the final pair. She squeezed once, the raider's muscles locked. Vitheran contact venom, fast-acting, perfectly non-lethal. The raider went rigid and fell like a tree. The 4th raider made it 2 steps back into the corridor before a shadow dropped from the ceiling. Drama hit him from above, wings spread, bioluminescent scales blazing red, the color of Firasi territorial rage. The hunting shriek that came from his throat was a sound that evolution had designed to freeze prey in place. It worked. Droma pinned him to the ceiling with his hind claws and held him there, wings beating slow, scales pulsing like an alarm made of light. The whole thing took 11 seconds. When ship security arrived 4 minutes later, weapons drawn, emergency lights flooding the corridor, they found the observation deck door open, and the Predator clutch standing in a loose formation over 4 unconscious Morhai raiders. Gorvash had not moved from his position near the entrance. His claws had blood on them. His breathing was steady. He looked, if anything, mildly annoyed. Behind him, near the viewport, a small human boy sat in the corner, holding an orange kitten. The kitten was grooming herself. The boy was watching the clutch with eyes that were no longer scared. They were something else, something bigger than fear, and bigger than gratitude, and bigger than any word that a 7-year-old knows. He was looking at them the way children look at people who will never, ever let anything hurt them. Yuna arrived 90 seconds later. She came through the security line at a full sprint, pushing past crew members twice her size, and she did not stop until she reached the observation deck. She saw the unconscious raiders. She saw the blood. She saw the 4 predators standing in the dark, like statues carved from violence. And she saw her son, sitting in Renkai's arms. Renkai was holding Teiho the way one might hold a bird with a broken wing. Both arms curled inward, claws retracted so far they had almost disappeared into his fingers. His massive body hunched over the boy like a shell. He was holding him as if Teiho were the most fragile and the most important thing he had ever touched. And he was holding him as if he would not let go until every star in the nebula went dark. Eunice stopped. Her chest was heaving. Her eyes were wet. Renkai looked at her. His yellow eyes were steady. He was not afraid, Renkai said. His voice was rough, and the human words came slowly, shaped by a mouth that was not built for them. He said you told him that brave people always find friends in the dark. Yuna's hand went to her mouth. She had said that. She had said it one night when Teiho was 5 and he was scared of the dark in his room, and she had sat with him and told him that the dark was not empty, that brave people always find friends in the dark, if they are brave enough to sit still and wait. She had forgotten she said it. He had not. Du-Yun arrived 2 minutes later, covered in coolant and engine grease, out of breath, wild-eyed. He saw Yuna. He saw Teiho. He saw the clutch. He saw the raiders on the floor. His brain tried to process all of it at once and failed, so it picked the most important thing and held on to it. His son was alive. His son was safe. His son was being held by a warrior who would have died before letting him fall. Du-Yun walked to Gorvash. The Kathrani commander stood a full 3 feet taller than him. His claws still had blood on them. His eyes were still that dark, old, terrible color. Du-Yun put his hand on Gorvash's armored shoulder. It was a small hand on a very large shoulder. It should have looked ridiculous. It did not look ridiculous. Gorvash looked down at the hand. He looked at the human man. He saw in Du-Yun's eyes the same thing he had felt standing between those raiders and that small boy. The same ancient, wordless, boundless thing that lived in every parent and every protector across every species in every corner of the galaxy. Gorvash placed his own massive hand over Du-Yun's. He held it there for 3 seconds. Then he let go, and Du-Yun went to his son. The security team took the raiders away. The medical team checked Teiho, who was perfectly fine. Nabi was also perfectly fine. She had found a piece of raider armor on the floor and was sitting on it, cleaning her whiskers, looking extremely pleased with herself. The observation deck was quiet again. The nebula burned on. The stars were being born, one by one, behind the glass. And in the corridor outside, where she thought no one could see her, Syleth stood very still. All 6 limbs pressed against the wall, her compound eyes unfocused. She was shaking. Not from fear, not from adrenaline, from something she had not felt since she was a larva in her mother's colony. She had felt the need to protect something, not out of duty, not out of instinct, out of love. So she stood in the corridor and shook, and the nebula light painted her in shades of gold. The Morkai Raider vessel was disabled, towed, and its crew placed in containment cells on the lower deck. The pale horizon resumed its course through the nebula. Systems were repaired, coolant lines were patched, the microfractures in the hull were sealed. Within 48 hours, the ship was running as if nothing had happened. But everything had happened, and the ship was not the same. The security footage was the reason. Someone in the monitoring team had pulled the recording from the observation deck, and within half a day, every crew member on the ship had seen it. It was not classified. It was not restricted. It simply moved from screen to screen, passed along in silence, watched and rewatched by species who had never agreed on anything before. The footage showed the observation deck in the minutes before the attack. It showed a small human boy running through the door, holding a kitten, breathing hard, glasses crooked. It showed Gorvash picking him up with one hand and carrying him to safety. It showed the boy's face when the commander told him to stay. Scared, trembling, but trusting. Then it showed the fight. 11 seconds of absolute violence, precise and overwhelming. 4 of the deadliest creatures in the Galactic Union moving in perfect coordination to destroy a threat before it could reach a child who was not even their species. And then it showed the aftermath. Renkai holding the boy, Gorvash standing guard, Sylith and Dromov flanking the room. 4 predators, covered in blood and battle damage, arranged around a 7-year-old human and his kitten like a fortress made of scale and wing and claw. The herbivore species watched that footage, and something shifted inside them. Something old and deep and calcified, a fear that had been built into their biology for 100,000 years, cracked. Not because the predators had become less dangerous. They had become more dangerous. The footage proved that beyond any doubt. But the footage also proved something else. That the violence had a direction. That the danger had a purpose. That these terrifying creatures, these nightmares with claws and venom and wings, had chosen to point all of their fury at anything that threatened a small, helpless child who had once sat beside them and said, "Look at the stars." Counselor Pei filed his final report on the social segregation issue. It was 1 sentence long. Problem resolved. Recommend no further intervention. The change was gradual, but it was real. On the 3rd evening after the attack, a Halisi engineer named Voss walked into the observation deck during the clutch's hours. She was shaking so badly that her whiskers vibrated. She was carrying a datapad and a cup of tea, and she sat down near the door, as far from the predators as physically possible while still being in the room. Gorvash glanced at her once, then turned back to the viewport. Teho waved. Nabi ignored her, which for a cat was a sign of acceptance. Voss came back the next evening, and the next. On the 4th evening, she moved her chair 2 meters closer. A week later, a group of Drovani scientists began visiting. They sat in a cluster near the center of the room, speaking softly among themselves. One of them, a young botanist with pale green skin and nervous eyes, spent an entire evening watching Droma's light shows with open fascination. When Droma noticed her watching, he shifted his colors to include the specific wavelength that Drovani found most soothing. The botanist blinked, then smiled. It was the first time a Drovani had ever smiled at a Firasi. The observation deck was becoming what Counselor Pei had always wanted it to be. A shared space. A common ground. Not because anyone had forced it or planned it, but because a boy and his cat had walked into the dark and found friends, and the rest of the ship had finally found the courage to follow. 3 weeks after the attack, Gorvash submitted a formal request to the Kathrani High Command. The request was unusual. In fact, it was unprecedented. He was asking that a non-Kathrani, non-predator individual be granted the status of Clutchkin. It was an ancient honor, older than the Galactic Union itself, rooted in the deepest traditions of Kathrani warrior culture. Clutchkin meant family. It meant blood bonded. It meant that every Kathrani who lived, and every Kathrani who would ever live, was bound by law and honor to protect the named individual as if they were born of the same clutch. It had never been given to a human. It had never been given to a child. It had never been given to anyone outside the predator species. Gorvash sent the request. He attached the security footage. He attached his own service record. And he attached a single personal statement that read, "This child walked into the dark without fear, and sat among us as if we were worthy of his trust. We were not. He made us so." The Kathrani High Command reviewed the request. They watched the footage. They read the statement. They approved it unanimously. The ceremony was held on the observation deck. Of course it was. There was nowhere else it could be. It was small and simple, as Kathrani ceremonies always were. The clutch stood in a line. Gorvash stood at the center. Tejo stood before him, wearing his best shirt, which was a blue one with a small rocket on the front. Nabi sat at his feet, batting at a loose thread on his shoe. Yuna and Doyun stood behind their son. Yuna was crying before the ceremony started. Doyun was not crying, but his jaw was doing something very complicated. Halisi, Drovani, Pelori, the engineering teams, the science teams, the navigation crew. They filled the observation deck until there was standing room only, pressed together, predator and prey, side by side, looking forward. Gorvash knelt. Even kneeling, his eyes were level with the boys. He held out a carved crest. It was made from Kathrani heartstone, a mineral found only in the deepest caves of the Kathrani homeworld. It was dark gray, almost black, polished smooth, with the symbol of the clutch etched into its surface. It was strung on a cord sized for a child's neck. "Tejo," Gorvash said. His deep voice filled the room like the sound of a mountain speaking. "By the law of the clutch, by the bond of blood and trust, I name you Clutchkin. You are family. Where you walk, we walk. Where you fall, we catch you. Where you sleep, we guard you. This is the old promise. This is the new law." He placed the crest around Tejo's neck. It hung against the little rocket on his shirt. Tejo looked at the crest. He touched it with his small fingers. He looked up at Gorvash. Then he stepped forward and hugged the warrior around the leg, because it was the highest point he could reach. He pressed his face against the armored thigh and held on with both arms and everything he had. Gorvash stood very still. His iron eyes were fixed on a point somewhere above the crowd. His jaw was set. His hands hung at his sides, claws retracted, fingers open. Renkai, standing 2 paces to the right, would later claim that he saw moisture in the commander's eyes. He would also later claim that he valued his life and would never mention it again. The weeks that followed were different. Not dramatically different, not overnight different, but different in the way that a river is different after a stone has been dropped into it. The ripples kept going. Sylith published her treatise. She had been working on it every evening on the observation deck, reading sections aloud to Tejo, who listened seriously and occasionally asked questions that made her rewrite entire chapters. The final work was titled On the Disarmament of Instinct, How a Human Child and a Creature Called Nabi Redefined the Predator-Prey Boundary. It was accepted by 3 Galactic Union academic institutions within a month. It became required reading in 2 of them. The dedication page said, "For Tejo, who asked the questions that scholars forgot." Droma stopped hiding his light shows. Every evening, he performed for Nabi, and for anyone else who wanted to watch. The Drovani botanist began sitting directly below his perch, sketching his light patterns in a notebook. Other crew members gathered. Droma cycled through colors and shapes and patterns that he had never shown anyone, things he had kept private for his entire life. Firasi art that was meant to be performed alone in the dark. When a Halisi crew member once teased him about it, asking if the great Firasi hunter had been reduced to an entertainer for a small cat, Droma turned his luminescent eyes toward the Halisi and said simply, "The small hunter enjoys it. I am not ashamed." Renkai kept carving. His little figures got better. He made a Vytherin, a Firasi, a small cat with its tail up, a human boy with round glasses. He gave them all to Taeho, who lined them up on his windowsill in his cabin, like a small army of friends. And every evening, as the nebula turned and the stars were born, and the pale horizon carried them all forward through the deep and endless dark, the observation deck filled with light and life, and the quiet sound of a small orange cat purring on the foot of the largest warrior in the Galactic Union. On one of those evenings, the last evening before the ship reached the next station, Yuna stood in the doorway and watched. Do-Yoon stood beside her. The deck was full. Every species on the ship, sitting together, talking or reading or simply being in each other's presence. Taeho was asleep against the viewport, his cheek pressed to the glass, his breath making a small circle of fog. Nabi was draped across Borvash's massive clawed foot, purring steadily, her small body rising and falling with each breath. Renkai sat beside them, whittling something new. Silith read aloud in a low murmur. Droma hummed a Firasi lullaby, his wings cycling soft blue light that painted the walls like water. Do-Yoon leaned close to Yuna and whispered, "I think our son just united a warship." Yuna smiled. Her eyes were bright. "No," she said. "Nabi did. Taeho was just the delivery system." Do-Yoon laughed softly. On the viewport glass, fogged by a sleeping child's breath, there was a small drawing. Taeho had traced it with his fingertip before falling asleep. A stick figure boy. A tiny cat shape with triangle ears, and 4 large shapes around them, one with claws, one with 6 legs, one with wings, and one so big it barely fit. Underneath, in clumsy letters written backward because he had drawn it from inside, was a single word: family. The nebula light shifted, the stars burned on, and the small orange cat purred in her sleep, pressed against the foot of a warrior who had once been the most feared creature on the ship, and who now, though he would never admit it, would not have traded this strange and impossible peace for all the battles in the galaxy.